along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, Ghosting the News by Margaret Sullivan. Margaret's book is part of a series from Columbia Global Reports. And if you're not familiar with this series, I urge you to get to know it. CGR is a publishing imprint from Columbia University that commissions authors to do original reporting on a wide range of particularly important issues. The books are compact and concise, like Margaret's is. And like Margaret's book, they tend to be packed with lots of relevant information and address complex issues in a very timely way. In Ghosting the News, Margaret reports on what she calls the most troubling media story of our time, the decline of local journalism and the dire consequences of this trend for individual communities and for our democracy. The extent of this erosion, which you'll hear detailed in a minute, has been staggering. And while Margaret also looks at some possible solutions and describes herself as not without hope, the future of local news looks quite grim. Margaret herself is a great person to tell this story. She's a longtime journalist who, after growing up in the Buffalo area, worked her way up at the Buffalo News, eventually becoming the paper's top editor for 13 years. She moved to the New York Times in 2012 to become the public editor there, representing readers as a sort of ombudsman, then 4 years later joined the Washington Post as a media columnist. In conversation with Margaret will be Walter Isaacson, who rose to the top of both print and broadcast journalism as managing editor of Time magazine, and then chairman and CEO of CNN. Since then, he served as president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, and now as a history professor at Tulane. He's also a best-selling author and first-rate biographer with works on Henry Kissinger, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, and most recently, Leonardo da Vinci. So Margaret and Walter, the screen is yours.
Hey, thank you for having us, Brad. It's always good to be at Politics and Prose, even if it's kind of virtual this time. We look forward to being back. Thanks for that nice introduction and for the shout out to Columbia Global Reports. I want to give a little bit of an extra shout out to Nick Lemon, my homeboy here from New Orleans, who I grew up with and runs it, and Camille McDuffie. They do a great job with these, and proving they do such a great job is they got Margaret Sullivan to write this book. And Margaret, you're up near Buffalo, at least you can look across the lake probably and see it. You spend so much time there, and you begin your book in Buffalo. So let's set the stage, if you would, by telling us what you learned when you left Buffalo.
Well, during the time that I was in Buffalo, I began there actually as a summer intern. And then I did a bunch of different jobs, and I guess I stuck around long enough to become the editor. But in the early years that I was there, the paper was really thriving. It was owned by Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway. It was making a lot of money. The profit margin was probably somewhere around 30% profit margin for a long time. And, after a couple of years of Buffett's ownership, they started a newspaper war and the other paper in town went out of business. So then they kind of had a monopoly. That all looked pretty darn good for a long time until the internet came along. I guess that's the easiest way to put it. Craigslist took a lot of the classified advertising. The Great Recession of 2008 really kicked the legs out from under the remaining amount of print advertising. And, while the paper right now still publishes 7 days a week, and is certainly a respectable and very good paper, I think. I get it every day here. It is, certainly shrunken from what it was when at its height. The newsroom that I was in charge of had about 200 people in it. And by the time I left, it was 150. And right now it's well under 100. So the problem, as you know, Walter, is you can't actually in journalism do more with less. You end up doing less with less. And this trajectory is happening all over the country. In fact, I would say the Buffalo News is in significantly better shape than a lot of the papers around the country. And you know from New Orleans that the Times-Picayune, as it was, is no longer.
Yeah, we had a newspaper war and it kind of merged with the Advocate. But your former owner, as you quote him in the book, Warren Buffett, used the word toast for local
right.
newspapers. You mentioned the internet generically as having caused this problem. But drill down for me, if you would, a little more specifically. Was it giving away the content for free that was the original sin? Was it Facebook and Google and others being aggregators?
Well, there were a lot of different factors. I think that the biggest thing that happened was that, you know, the thing that shored up newspapers and paid the bills for such a long time was print advertising. So the formula was something like 2/3 of revenue came from print advertising and something like 1/3 would come from subscriptions. As the internet got stronger, you know, advertisers found different, more direct, more targeted ways to deliver their message. And subscribers found other ways of getting their news, sometimes on social media. I mean, there's no question that Facebook and Google have sucked up a lot of the vast majority of digital advertising. For a while, newspaper companies thought, oh, well, we'll be able to make up the difference in print advertising by, you know, through digital advertising. And that is something that just never came to pass. And then, as you say, we went through this period of giving the paper away for free, which never really made a lot of sense because it costs a lot of money to put reporters on the street and in town, in city council meetings and at school boards. And so what sense did it really make to ask people, you know, to give it away for free? You had to pay for the print, but you'd get it for free on the internet. So a lot of people made the judgment, well, gee, I guess I don't need the print edition. I can just get it on, you know, for free. And this was, again, going on all over the country. So there was definitely some bad decision-making and some sort of structural issues that came along that would have been very difficult anyway.
You talked about just now, you talked about how one of the things that hurt the newspaper business is that the internet was filled with all sorts of information. You could get your news from Facebook, you could get it from social media, you get it from Twitter. I know you talked about this in the book, but why are we worse off when we have so much more information now because we can get it all from the internet?
You can get a lot of information on the internet, but what you can't get as much anymore is the deeply reported local information. I mean, national politics, sure, there's a lot of sources for that. International affairs, there are a lot of sources for that. But what there isn't is this local, you know, deeply reported local information that's done by people who know how to file a Freedom of Information request, develop sources, do an investigative piece. And, you know, I want to be clear, it's not that there is none of that. We've seen a lot of new digital only startups come along, investigative or otherwise. Some of them are nonprofits, some of them are for-profits. They have really contributed a great deal. My view is they haven't filled the gap that has been left by newspapers. And the problem too is that it's very difficult to make that kind of thing scale. We've lost more than 2,000 newspapers since 2004. They've simply gone out of business, weeklies and dailies. And you can't expect there to be a philanthropically or membership funded digital startup in each one of these communities that's lost a newspaper. Just kind of doesn't work that way.
Another punch that news has faced is President Trump continually talking about fake news, undermining our sense of the value of journalism. How bad has that been?
It's been bad. I think that it's really, it has trickled into communities. It's not just happening in the, the press briefings or among congressional reporters, but we see this happening on the local front too. One of my colleagues, Jerry Zaremski, the Buffalo News's former colleague, the Buffalo News's Washington correspondent, did a lot of reporting on a member of Congress, Chris Collins, and broke the story of insider trading. He was convicted ultimately, or pled guilty to some insider trading charges. And when Jerry reported on this, Collins ran around saying it was fake news and blaming the paper for reporting what was factual. And even, this will sound familiar, sent out fundraising requests based on this nasty reporting as he portrayed it, which ultimately turned out to be accurate and right and true.
And as you say in your book, there were people in that district who'd never even heard of this indictment because they were in news deserts, meaning parts of the district that had no local newspaper. And he won until he got thrown in jail.
Right. He his opponent told me that in certain parts of the district, and one in particular that was called a news desert, a place that doesn't have a lot of local news, it does have a small, little engine that could website called Orleans Hub. But in some of these places in the district, he would tell people, come on, you're not going to vote for this guy who's been indicted, are you? And some of them, he told me, just didn't know that their congressman had been indicted. However, in the parts of the district that were better served by local news, people crossed the aisle. They may have been Republicans, but they crossed the aisle to vote for the challenger, who was a Democrat. So I think, while it's not a perfect, you can't say, oh, he absolutely won or lost or got votes because of this. I think there is a cause and effect there, and it's sobering.
A quick word to people in our audience. I had noticed at least one question popping up in the chat room, and I'll get to that. But please put your questions in the Q&A button, not the chat room button. Brad has a system here, and we have to abide by it. We talked about Facebook a moment ago, and people saying, well, I get my news from Facebook. Facebook, out of some sense of obligation or guilt or whatever it is, says, well, we're going to help local journalism. Why are they doing that? Is that because they feel they need local journalism for them to continue to thrive? And secondly, are they really doing it? I saw something where you said they were giving, I think, $1.5 million to something, and that's like 1/100th of what they make in a day.
Pocket change for Facebook. Facebook from time to time makes these public relations efforts. They know that it doesn't look good for them, that local news organizations are going out of business, and some people are blaming Facebook and Google for it. So there may be some sense of civic responsibility. I haven't noticed that as a strong suit of theirs, but maybe. So, they said that they would start featuring more local news and paying some news organizations for it. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it really makes a difference. And it certainly doesn't sort of cut into the larger problem. And of course, as we know, when people are on Facebook, they're often, sequestered in their kind of echo chambers. Local news is great because it's one of the ways that people kind of emerge from their echo chambers and have a shared sense of facts about their community. They may disagree about what to do about those facts, but they can agree that something's happening.
Yeah, do you think that newspapers should maybe withhold the right of Facebook or even Google to repurpose their material or demand royalties for it?
Well, something that newspaper companies are trying to do right now is to gain a temporary antitrust exemption so that they can get together to negotiate with Facebook and Google. I mean, right now, if the, let's say, Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Advocate in Baton Rouge tries to negotiate with Facebook and Google, it is truly a David and Goliath situation. But if they could get together, they might have the power of numbers. So far, that hasn't come to pass, but you know, it would be a 4-year exemption that would sort of allow them to get on their feet a little bit more, and I favor it.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the music industry had to do with Napster and other things. And although when the book industry tried to do it with Amazon, it got hit with an antitrust suit. So we're in complex territory here.
That's right.
Well, one model for the news is for the newspaper that you work for, the Washington Post, which is to have what we'll call a benevolent billionaire owner, which, by the way, has happened here in New Orleans too, where, you know, a local wealthy person decided to run the newspaper, buy the newspaper. What are the upsides and downsides of that as a business strategy?
Well, you have to pick the right billionaire, you see. So for one thing, you want to pick a billionaire. Of course, we don't really get to pick, but let's say we could pick. We would pick a billionaire who would leave the editorial product alone. That doesn't always happen. I mean, there have been reports of Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas being, at least early on, I've heard better things now, but at least early on, being intrusive into what the paper was covering, how it was covering his businesses, and so on. You know, you need somebody who doesn't interfere, and someone with particularly deep pockets is great. Bezos was very helpful to the Post, not only in taking it over at a tough time, but in giving the paper what he called runway. He gave them, he wanted to give the Washington Post enough time and money to sort of figure out what the business model could be. And the Post, I think, has really done that. But the Post has done something that most local newspapers or regional papers can't do, which is appeal to a national and even global audience. So the Post, you know, has many, many digital subscriptions and has grown that, and it's been really important. But you can't expect that to happen in San Jose, and you can't expect it to really happen in Chicago. You know, most people are not going to subscribe to, you know, these regional newspapers, the Miami Herald, which is really a fabulous paper and has done such important work, but they're not really going to probably have a national audience. And so there's just less of a field to gather some of the subscriptions from.
You know, along those lines, there are many times when I'll want an article from the San Jose Mercury News, which, you know, covers Silicon Valley very well. And I certainly want it with the Boston Globe when baseball season's about to happen. And there'll be at times even where I'll say, okay, I would love that thing from Chicago or the Houston Chronicle. But the only way I can get it, if there's a paywall, is I have to subscribe. I don't want to subscribe for an entire year to the Chicago Tribune just because there's a good article. Why don't we have some model that allows me to pay per drink instead of just pay for all you can drink?
Right. I mean, you know, something that addresses that is a good idea. I don't know if it's I mean, there've been so-called micropayments that have been tried, and they, for whatever reason, haven't been particularly successful. But you know, there's this thing in the fitness world called ClassPass, which allows you to kind of pop around and go to different gyms, and maybe a ClassPass for publications is an option.
I would love an Easy Pass. I mean, just
right,
like
there
you
you
can go
go.
to Tollbooth and for it to deduct from my Easy Pass every time I did it. Steve Brill was working on that, and he was either ahead of his time or it just didn't work. We'll see if it comes
Yes,
out.
that's right.
So go back for a moment to the models. Does it have to be ad supported or are we now seeing that subscription-based models really can work?
Well, I think there has to be some kind of I think there need to be various revenue streams, or it just doesn't work. the newer, organizations, for example, although now it's been around for a while, but if you look at the Texas Tribune in Austin, probably the prototypical nonprofit news organization that's been successful, that is partly membership, but it's also partly philanthropy. And they have this big event every year called the Texas Tribune Festival, and it makes millions of dollars. So again, that's hard to replicate in every town, but I think you can't really just depend on one thing to be the dominant revenue source the way we used to.
I think 5-10 years ago, we would be surprised that some of the big winners in the digital information space were legacy newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal in particular.
Yes.
As you said, they can do things that a Times-Picayune or even a Boston Globe can't. But are you surprised that some of the new types of journalistic organizations, Huffington Post, Daily Beast, and whatever, BuzzFeed, have done okay, but they haven't taken over the world, and these legacy organizations have figured out how to do it?
Yeah, it is surprising. I think you're right. If we looked back 5 or 10 years ago, we would have thought, oh, these are the survivors are going to be the BuzzFeeds. And BuzzFeed does survive, but it's had its share of layoffs and it's not doing great economically. Whereas if you take the New York Times, it has managed to get its digital subscriptions. I think they're at 4 million now. When I was there as public editor, they crossed over an important milestone from the dominant revenue source being advertising to the dominant revenue source being, subscribers in one way or another, readership. And so, but the Wall Street Journal had a great piece a while back that looked at what they called the haves and have-nots of the journalism world. And as you say, the haves are the Post and the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and not many others. And the have-nots, sadly, are these local papers who do such important work. Right now, at this time where we're experiencing a pandemic that has such important local consequences, you want to know about the rate of infection in your area, the hospitalization rate, all this kind of thing. They're providing such important information, but their reporting ranks have really shrunk. And their reporters are going from doing all this hard work on the coronavirus to maybe being furloughed for a week and then coming back. There have been many layoffs and furloughs.
I think you're absolutely right. This coronavirus crisis has shown us the importance of local reporting, not just in the places you said on health reporting, but we used to have somebody covering the school board all the time. Well, the school board is a very important thing to be covering at this moment when it's trying to figure out what to do. Let's see, the Q&A button. Don't forget to ask Margaret your questions in the Q&A buttons. All right, we're going to move to that in just a second. Let me make sure I retout this book, Buying the News, and if you go into the chat room, you'll figure out exactly how you can get it. But in the book, you talk not only about local newspapers, you say local journalism in general, that we're also having this problem with radio and TV, right?
Right. Less so, certainly with TV, because TV has some protections because of, the way they fund themselves, the retransmission rates. They get some revenue that sort of shores them up. But and local radio, has had its ups and downs. Public radio has high ambitions in these cities and regions, but they've had their share of economic woes as well recently. So, and the thing is, I think while those, television, local television and local radio are really important, they're kind of not built to do the kinds of stuff that newspapers have traditionally done. As you say, like go to every school board meeting, work your sources, know who the players are, get the tips about the investigative piece. They may do some of that, but they're kind of not built for that granular coverage that's really so important. And, when I was in Youngstown, Ohio last summer, visiting with the folks at the Vindicator, which was going out of business entirely. I got there before they closed their doors, and I chatted with the publisher, and he said at one time when they were stronger, they were able to send someone to pretty much every board meeting in a 3-county area. And I remember so vividly what he said, that he said, and the people, the elected officials knew we were there and they behaved. So it was a question of really sort of bearing witness, being there, and being that kind of built-in watchdog.
My final question before we go to the Q&As is, you've mentioned a couple of times these new types of organizations, Texas Tribune, ProPublica, that are digital only and are trying to do new models. Our friend Andy Lack is doing it in Mississippi with Mississippi Today. We have a couple, the Lens down here in New Orleans. How are those going to help us with this ecosystem, or will they be unable to replace newspapers?
I mean, I think they do help a lot. And what's good about them is they tend to be more nimble, a little less hidebound, less tied to tradition, and they can do some really interesting work. I mean, they too have to raise money. It's tough to raise money right now because people are in economic straits. They have to support themselves. They also tend to be quite a bit smaller. The ones that are in a lot of regional, a lot of sort of decent sized cities, they might have 5 or 10 reporters. That's a far cry from, Denver, which used to have 2 big newspapers, each with a 300-person newsroom.
But they tend to be supported by foundations and philanthropists as
That's
well,
right.
as opposed to, and there's a danger, it seems to me, to be supported by even a nice foundation as opposed to supported by your readers.
That's right. I mean, foundations and philanthropists may be very well intended, but they certainly may have a particular kind of work in mind that they'd like to see done. And so, you have to deal with that.
All right, from the Q&A box, Pete Davis says, the Washington Post still covers major local news stories, but I get more that I'm interested in, more that interests me from my neighborhood listserv, a curated listserv. Why don't newspapers, this is something I'd always wondered about too, why don't they link up with all these listservs? Why don't they curate? Why don't they help manage these listservs and thus supplement their reporting?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't really know the answer to it. Some newsrooms have, it may come down to some newsrooms have unions, and unions may not want to give up their right to do the reporting. That could be a piece of it. And also, I think it's hard to absorb that kind of change and, bring it into your way of doing things, which tends to be, done by professional reporters that we can edit, we can get behind their work legally. We know that we can verify it and all of that. When you take on sort of citizen journalism, you may get a lot of good information, but if you have to back it up in court, are you willing to do that? I think there are some sort of institutional and maybe even bureaucratic reasons that it's not very practical.
And so they wouldn't get Section 230 protection if somebody's posting, is what you're saying.
Maybe not, and it may well be. It's not the first time I've heard that. And I know that people do get a lot of good information that way. So it may be something that's worth exploring.
Well, it does tie into what Eugene Guadis asked, a question that's tied right into what you just said, which is we're talking about citizen journalists. We're talking about amateur journalists. People carrying their cell phones. And is this something that we can weave in to professional journalism, or has this made it tougher for professional journalists?
Well, for one thing, it is fantastic to have an entire, sort of armies of people out there who are recording and providing, videos particularly. The George Floyd video was shot by a 17-year-old girl who was on her way to get a snack. And she said she thought the world needed to see what she was seeing. And, she actually, that video has changed the world. So it is certainly very important. And I think it's becoming more important. I have a section in my book about East Lansing, Michigan, where a woman decided to, get a group of people together who were not professional journalists. Some of them were retirees and housewives and people who were out of work, whatever. And she sort of trained them to go out and cover meetings and to do the work of professional journalists. And they have uncovered a lot of really important stories. And, she doesn't pay them much, but she said that it's really working and it's really worthwhile. And her comment was, people thought, well, there's nothing really happening in East Lansing, so why bother? She said, well, after you start getting some journalists out there, you find out there's a lot happening. It's just we didn't know about it.
Another person asked the question, why is there resistance to an all digital format?
I mean, I don't have that resistance. I think that, these new organizations that have come up are all digital, and they wouldn't really dream of, buying printing presses and, vats of ink or anything like that. I mean, we're obviously in a digital world right now, but many people still like to get the paper in print. Print advertising still is a factor. It's not the factor that it used to be, but if the Washington Post or the Chicago Tribune were to convert tomorrow to all digital, I think you'd lose some of your readership, and it would be possibly just a little too much of a sea change all at once. We're trying to cross that bridge. It's the kind of the getting there that's the tough part.
I wonder if we get Brad Graham back in here, because the question of at bookstores, we've gotten a level where maybe half and half, it's digital versus print. People like both formats.
Right.
Do you have a sense, Margaret, as to whether there'll ever be sort of a plateau or leveling off where we'll get to 70-30 digital?
Oh, I think we're headed that way. I mean, what I think will happen with a lot of newspapers is they'll publish a Sunday print edition, and otherwise they'll be digital. And that Sunday print edition will do some special things, and it'll be big, and it'll have whatever advertising there may be. And the rest of the time there'll be a, constantly updated website without the costs of doing that, taking these papers. I mean, it really is out of a different century. So I
agree with you, but I think the Sunday paper will come on Saturday, which is the day we now want it.
Okay, well, I'll remember you said that. We'll see if that comes to pass.
So we have a lot of besides the benevolent billionaire model or the foundation model or the local person model, another model that we're being hit with, I'll say, because I'm not sure it's the greatest thing in the world, are hedge funds buying up newspapers. First Digital Media, I think, just snapped up some. Is that necessarily leading to the destruction of newspapers, or might that work?
Well, it's not a good thing. The hedge funds are buying newspapers in large quantities. They're buying up chains of newspapers. The McClatchy chain, which includes the Miami Herald and the Charlotte Observer and the Sacramento Bee, some really Kansas City Star, just got bought out of auction by a Canadian-based hedge fund. This is not good news at all, because these companies are not looking, generally, they say they are, but I don't believe they are. They're not looking to sustain journalism over the long haul. They're looking to make a quick profit with whatever they can right now. Maybe they'll sell off the real estate. Maybe they'll cut reporting to the bone and take whatever profits are left and sort of strip it for parts. It's a huge and very discouraging trend that we're seeing and have been seeing for quite some time.
Along these lines, even though it popped up in the chat room, and I'll remind people to go to the Q&A room instead, But in the chat room, there's a question from Lauren Leroy to all, which is basically, you also have groups like Sinclair, which are mainly buying broadcast outlets, but groups like that that buy it for ideological reasons. Is there, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, the famous thing that people remember about Sinclair, and Sinclair does have a Washington, DC station, is that at one point, and I think they may have eased off on this a bit now, but they were mandating that their stations, include these kind of editorials that would be read on the air, and they were exactly the same in every market. They were very conservative, and they were presented, I don't think with sufficient context about what this thing was that you were hearing. And it was a way to get a message out there that looked kind of like news, but wasn't really news. It was editorial, opinion content that was cookie cutter across all of their newspapers. And, not a great trend. I think that that has eased somewhat. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see as we get into the height of the presidential election season, whether it'll make a comeback.
Well, you're touting objective and neutral as being qualities of good journalism, and you and I grew up in that tradition. But, historically, I mean, even when my old friend Benjamin Franklin comes to Philadelphia as a runaway, there are 8 or 9 papers. He starts his own, but they all have an ideological slant. They're supporting the proprietors or the local governors or the royal family. Do you think that this digital revolution and the change in the way we're doing things might bring us back, or should bring us back, to this notion of, yes, outlets are supposed to have a slant, supposed to have an opinion. They should not just be objective and neutral.
Well, we certainly see that in the cable news world, where if you turn on MSNBC or you turn on Fox, you know what you're getting. I think that they're very different from each other, because I think MSNBC at least deals mostly in the world of verifiable facts and with less of an agenda than Fox News. But in most cities and towns, if there's only going to be 1 or 2 news organizations, I think that suggests that you'd like to have it be able to represent, able to speak to the entire community. I don't know that we're going to have 6 or 7 each with their own bent. I mean, maybe that will come to pass in sort of a Back to the Future way, but overall, I think that there needs to be a strong sense of impartiality and fairness that is less about opinion and more about reporting.
Yeah, although it has come to pass in certain areas of the blogosphere, even the local blogosphere, which kind of allows that raucous, opinionated type of journalism.
Right, and I think that has its place without a doubt. There's actually, of course, this huge debate right now about whether objectivity even exists and whether we should seek objectivity in journalism or whether it's an outdated concept. It comes up at times like today when we're dealing with civic, racial unrest and, a quest for racial justice. Should news organizations stand for something? Yeah, I think they should stand for something. And I think they should stand for example, press rights. They should stand for equal justice under the law. I think those things don't put them in a partisan position, but put them in a position that supports our democracy.
I'm going to go out of your book range here, but hearing you talk about it as a press critic, what do you make of what's happening at the New York Times?
Can you be more specific? Because there's always a lot happening there, as I found out.
I was trying to give it to you so you could hit it wherever you wanted it. I was talking partly about the sense in the newsroom that, as you just said, it ought to stand for things, and that when our old friend James Bennett runs a op-ed by Senator Cotton, leave aside all the intricacies of that case, people get up in arms about it. Is that a trend that's going to happen in journalism, and is that healthy?
Well, the New York Times is singular, and what happens there tends to get elevated and talked about a lot. But a lot of newsrooms are in turmoil right now. One of the big things that's happening, and this was the underpinning for what happened at the Times, is that staff feels that there isn't sufficient diversity particularly among leadership, so that the people making the decisions and the sort of gatekeepers of information don't really look like the whole country. And, the feeling is strong that that needs to change. And staff is putting demands on leadership to make it change. And I think that's a healthy thing. A diverse staff and diverse leadership isn't just about the numbers. It's not just about, so you can say I've got X% of this or that. It's so that the decisions that are made are more representative. So what's happening in these newsrooms is really uncomfortable. It's very tense, and it's overall, I think, a necessary corrective.
Amy Yee in our Q&A room asked, what are some of the potential solutions? I know we've talked about a few, besides, in addition to philanthropies. Could there be a tax to fund local media? And I know Nick Lemon, who helped publish this, at one point there should be even federal subsidies, which is another way of saying a tax to fund local media. Should there be a tax on social media companies? Should there be a license fee like the BBC?
So these things are all being kicked around right now. And in Australia, there is an effort to essentially tax Facebook so as to get some revenue to support news organizations. In the United States, there's always been a feeling on the part of journalists and news organizations that we didn't want to go there, because the feeling was the most precious thing we have is our independence. And if you start taking government money, are you really independent anymore? Nick Lemon thinks you could build safeguards into the system so that it would work. And I think that's possible. I think it might take a long time to do it. And meanwhile, this whole media ecosystem is, circling the drain. It's really happening very, very fast. So, I think we have to explore every option. And I've kind of put aside my longtime feeling that we should never do that because it would cut into our independence. We need to sort of reinvent ourselves now fast.
Although the age of Trump doesn't make it feel like federal subsidies for local newspapers.
No, I mean, when you look at what's happened at Voice of America, not that that's exactly the same thing, but, now there's a very strongly, strongly partisan, I think you could say, appointee who's come in, and the journalists who've been there for a long time have sort of been fired or stepped down or scattered. So that ought to put a little bit of fear into us, I think.
Tracy Horton asked, do you see a future for other papers in the nonprofit structure the way the Philadelphia Inky has been doing?
Right. Well, that's a very informed question. So the Philadelphia Inquirer is, if I understand the structure right, it's actually, it itself is not nonprofit, but it's owned by a big, nonprofit organization called the Lenfest Institute. And similarly, a little bit of a different model, the Salt Lake Tribune has actually turned nonprofit. So this is a traditional newspaper that still publishes in print that's turned itself into a nonprofit entity. I think these things are promising, and if they keep them alive, if they keep the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Tampa Bay Times, which has a similar setup, and the Salt Lake Tribune around, I'm all for it. And I'd like to see the path made a little bit easier for these papers to go that route, as at the same time we're developing these other ways of doing it. One other organization that I think is worth mentioning is Report for America, which is sort of modeled on the Peace Corps, and it puts young journalists for sort of a service year into news organizations around the country that could use the help. So there are some really innovative and cool things going on right now.
We have a question from Margarita Moras, and I give her credit because she put it in the chat room and then moved it to the Q&A room. So she goes to the head of the queue here, which is, what's a real life example that you've experienced with loss of civic engagement due to the decline of local news?
So, you know, sometimes when we talk about this, it's difficult to describe what happens because you're sort of trying to describe a negative. Here are the stories that we would have had, but we don't have. But one thing we do know from studies is that people become, you know, people in the aggregate become less civically engaged. They vote less. They are less politically active. When they do vote, they vote along party lines more. They don't cross the aisle very much. It's sort of like they get pulled even more into this tribalism that I think is plaguing our society right now. So all of these things happen when local journalism fades. And interestingly, another thing that happens is that the cost of getting municipal bonds goes up when local news goes away. Why does it go up? Because everyone understands that if there's no one there to sort of watch the politicians, that there's likely to be less efficient spending, which might be a nice way of saying it. There could also be corruption that no one notices. So
we have empirical evidence on that?
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies done on it, and I cite them in the book.
Wow.
So it is really interesting to see that. So yes, I think that this stuff happens, and again, you know, it's like that East Lansing example. Well, gee, there was no news here until we started to look.
Margaret Lerman asked, and you describe it in the book because you go to it, the Texas Tribune event, how does it raise so much money? And before you start, I'll just say, one of the things I learned when I was at Time Magazine is that having events is actually good. It connects you to your readers, connects you to your sponsors and advertisers. So we did the Time 100. Then when I went to the Aspen Institute, I realized we could do things like ideas festivals. And I went to David Bradley at the Atlantic and said, why don't you partner in it? Because it's a future of journalism in a way, is to be able to have public events. And these things were quite profitable until the age of coronavirus.
Right. Well, first of all, you have to have a guy like Evan Smith, who runs the Texas Tribune and was one of the founders of it, who's just, you know, just an amazing person who never stops moving. But that event, which I think it's largely, I think most of the funds come through sponsorship. But they also, as you say, benefit the Texas Tribune because they foster this sense of belonging. And so then people are more likely to become members because, hey, I went to your really cool event and I had a great time, and now I want to give you some money. So I think it's about that sense of being part of the fabric of people's lives that you have to cultivate.
So from David Borodek, something else that's actually a chapter in your book, he asks, tell us about what's happening around the world. Is local journalism in trouble outside of our borders?
It is, because these trends that I'm talking about, which are sort of partly technological and partly sociological, don't really observe geographic lines. So particularly since the coronavirus came about, we've seen closures of newspapers in Great Britain. There have been layoffs everywhere. I mean, there probably are, I mean, I certainly wasn't able to do any kind of, you know, very thorough job of covering what was happening in every country. But in Brazil, in Australia, in Great Britain, and other places that I did, you know, do some reporting, they're having similar kinds of problems. So it does sort of, it's a global issue.
So Betsy Garside says the New York Times seems to have figured out how to segment different pieces of its content. You know, the cooking, the puzzles, they can subscribe to all sorts of different lifestyle things and to deliver those in separate chunks. Is that a model that could work local papers?
Right. And it's interesting because the Washington Post is doing a lot of that too. You know, our food section, which is called Voraciously, is very successful. And you know, she's right that sort of selling pieces of these to people is appealing. But I think it is, again, that sort of scale problem that you need to have a very big potential audience in order to segment it in that way. I'm not really sure that, you know, a small to medium sized newspaper can kind of break itself off in that way and really make enough money from each one of these things.
Wasn't the model of local journalism that it had to all be packaged together in order to get the sports? You had to actually have the international news, and that that model in some ways helped make us a general interest nation.
Yeah, I think so. You know, when you got the newspaper, you know, if you did turn every page, you'd probably, it's a sort of serendipity effect. You'd find some things that actually were pretty interesting, including some of the ads, by the way, which is another reason people would get the paper, that you wouldn't have stumbled across. I mean, if you're really interested in baseball, okay, but you're still going to get the paper, and maybe you'd look at the A section and find out what was happening in Lebanon while you were at it. So I think it did sort of force this. I mean, assuming you didn't just toss those sections out and, you know, go right for the sports section. One of the things that has taken a hit with this is arts and cultural news or feature writing, you know, movie reviews, book reviews, that I think, you know, papers had their own person to do those things. And you wanted to read your guy when a big new film came out. What did, you know, this person think about it? That those jobs have gone away for the most part. And I find that to be really sad.
Jill McKibben asked a question that follows up on something you just said, which is the word serendipity. As you flip through a newspaper or even scroll through a newspaper's website, you're going to stumble across things that you didn't know were in your silo of interest. You'll run into an international story or a cultural story that'll just pique your fancy. And she says the value of the print newspaper is that it exposes me to articles I wouldn't read, and it takes me out of my silo. Do you think the internet has sort of siloed us, has divided us, so we all go to our special interest corners of the blogosphere of the internet?
I do, and I find that really regrettable. I mean, I have to fight it myself. You know, I write about the news media, so I get all these newsletters that, you know, sometimes make it seem like this is the only thing that's happening in the world. And I know that people who have a specialty in tech or in whatever it may be, some form of entertainment or, you know, sports, they get very dug into their special interest and get more and more and more specialized in it. But they miss, you know, the big world out there, that, you know, the world of books, the world of some other sport that you don't cover, the, you know, international politics. I do think it's really regrettable. And I think we have to sort of take it on ourselves to fight that a bit. And I think reading a print newspaper from cover to cover is still a really good way to do it.
One of the questioners asked, do you think newspapers should have accepted the PPP money or similar type of coronavirus bailout packages?
I do. I do. You know, I know that the Seattle Times got PPP money, and I think that haven't noticed the Seattle Times becoming like a state-run operation overnight or anything like that. I think that we want these places to survive, and when you look at the sort of all the different places that are getting funding, I don't see any reason why newspapers shouldn't get it and take it too.
Peggy Archowski, who actually is involved with one of my old favorite, very local newspapers, because I used to live in Georgetown, She says the Georgetowner has been a popular paper for about 60 years, and it was always distributed for free. And she says, I think most of our readers think we're just fine, but we're struggling like everybody else, and our faithful longtime professional staff almost now have to work for free. We cover the ANC meetings, the town halls, all the things we talked about. We are truly the watchdog. Do you think that government, she says, should have funds for us? Or let me just add, what is your model for what I will call hyper-local or neighborhood newspapers that were so important on things like zoning issues?
Right. I mean, they're struggling and alternative newspapers, which cover sort of more like the arts, are really struggling too. A lot of them have gone out of business. I mean, the problem too, which she describes, is that most people don't know there's a problem here. So the help that you might get through donations or through subscriptions or whatever it might be isn't forthcoming because people don't know there's a problem. A Pew study not long ago showed that some 75% of respondents thought local news was doing really well, and they weren't used to paying for it. Only 1/6 of people ever paid for it. So part of the reason I wrote this book was to sort of raise people's consciousness about just how tough it is out there. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question about the Georgetowner. There are so many of these places. Again, there's a problem of scale.
This is from William Hostin, and we've been talking about how we've lost touch, the communities have lost touch with the news because of this situation we're in. But do you think journalists have also lost touch with communities because of this? In the past, they were part of a community, they were recognizable. When I grew up covering the courts beat here in New Orleans, everybody knew me, my family, whatever. We were in touch, but now that's just not the case.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that's really bad, which is that local journalism is more trusted than national journalism. And one of the reasons for that is, you might know a reporter because their child goes to school with your child, or they live in your neighborhood, or your parents knew each other, or whatever it may be. There's that community bond. And as that fractures more and more, I think the trust level is going to go down, and that's really unfortunate. So yes, I agree with the questioner's point of view on it, and it's one of the things that I think we need to try to save.
I'm going to let you end, but I'm going to summarize 3 or 4 questions that are in the Q&A queue with just a very simple summary, which is, well, what makes you optimistic? So
I think it's overstating it. I'd like to say I'm optimistic, but I'm actually quite worried. But I am heartened by the new organizations that have come along, and I'm heartened by the fact that people, I think, do care about their local newspaper, and it's time to get behind them with your wallet. While I'm not entirely optimistic, I hope that we can salvage some part of it while we build this new thing.
Wow, I hope so too. And is there anything, one other question that was like that, is there anything we could be doing more, meaning we, the normal person in the neighborhood?
I think there is something you can do, which is to support your local news organization in whatever way you can. That might be a subscription or a donation or going to their event and becoming involved. So don't let it go.
I feel that way about bookstores too. So I turn it back to Brad.
Thanks, Margaret and Walter, for a really informative discussion that covered quite a bit of ground. Saving local news is such a tough challenge, and not too long ago, independent bookstores also were being written off, but a number of us have bounced back. So let's hope, for the sake of our democracy, that something can be done to reverse the decline of local news before it's too late. Again, the title of Margaret's book is Ghosting the News, and you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that's posted in the chat column. And thanks again to everyone, to all of you, for tuning in. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Margaret and Brad. Yeah.